It's going.
Okay. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Welcome to the Bloomington Rotary Club's weekly celebration of service for August 25th, 2020. I'm your current president, Ashley Sullivan. Thank you so much for being here on this very, very important day. We'll hear more about that in just a moment. Michael, could you please show our flag? This flag is for 15 seconds of respectful silence for personal reflection. Please remain on mute and take this time to personally reflect. Thank you so much. Now I would like to introduce Judy Schroeder, who will be offering our reflection.
Tomorrow is Women's Equality Day. Tomorrow we celebrate the centennial of the certification, the formal adoption of the 19th Amendment. After more than 80 years of agitating, arguing, fighting, women finally won their right to vote. It was a significant achievement, something to celebrate, but let's look at the nuances. First of all, let's not forget that women in a handful of Western states had been able to vote since some of those states were territories as far back as 1869. But the 19th Amendment extended the right to women in all states, including Mississippi, where the legislature got around to ratifying it in 1984. Second, citizenship and the ability to vote are inextricably linked. Without one, it's impossible to achieve the other. Native Americans were not considered citizens with voting rights until 1924. And until 1952, federal policy barred immigrants of Asian descent from becoming US citizens able to vote. Third, the 19th Amendment did not guarantee access to the polls. Many Black women and men, while possessing suffrage on paper, could not truly exercise that right until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act barred racially discriminatory voting practices. 10 years later, jurisdictions with significant numbers of voters with limited English proficiency were required to provide voting materials and assistance in languages other than English. And of course, disenfranchisement continues today in various ingenious ways. So let's celebrate Women's Equality Day and the centennial of the 19th Amendment, but let's also recognize we're still fighting over voting rights, over citizenship rights, over women's rights. Please raise your hand if you believe we've achieved gender and racial equality in this country. It looks like we've got our work cut out for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. We certainly do. Now it's time to introduce our special guest today, which we have quite a few. Jim Bright, would you like to introduce any visiting Rotarians and guests of note?
Yeah, thank you, President Ashley. Got a great turnout today. I see we have 60 and maybe even a few more on the way here. So I'm pleased to introduce Mary Morgan, who's the Director of Advocacy for the Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, Mary Morgan. Also with us today, a good friend, Regina Moore, former city clerk and real advocate of public education, among other things. We have with us Suzanne Owen, independent writer and wife of late Bloomington Rotarian Kent Owen. A lot of memories of Kent. We were expecting Ruth Albright. Ruth, are you with us today? Don't see Ruth yet, but Ruth was expected to join us. We have Randy Wheeler, who is the secretary of our Rotary District, a member of the Rotary Club of Evansville. Great to have you with us, Randy. We have Josie Rice, who is with Wheeler Mission. They are an organizational member, as you know, and she works with Chris Michael Morrison. Megan Gerhardt, who is a member of the IU Bloomington Rotaract Club, past president. Megan, it's great to have you with us. And I see some other names on the screen here that I think may be guests of other Rotarians. Let's see, Marianne Williams is with us here today.
Hello.
Marianne, welcome, great to have you with us. And I saw, is it Doris Willenberg? Hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Doris, but I think I saw you. Okay. And welcome. So glad you could join us today. Any other guests who I might have missed?
Yeah,
I have a guest. I have a guest also.
Okay. Go ahead, please.
Oh, this is Kate, and my guest is Dina Kellums, who is the Indiana University archivist. Some of our members will know her well because of having worked with her. Owen and Jim Capshew jumped to mind. And I would mention, which she probably won't want me to mention, that last week she received a bicentennial medal for her leadership of the archives in all of the work for the IU bicentennial events. Richly deserved. The archives has done wonderful work. So Dina, a warm welcome, please.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome, Dina.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I have one. I'd like to introduce Eileen Schaefer. She is a private banker, a German American, and she has to update her picture, she said, before she would go live. But she's actually considering joining the club. So let's give her a warm welcome. She'll be a great asset.
Awesome. Welcome, Eileen. Anybody else? Okay, back to you, President Ashley.
Thanks so much. So good to have so many guests with us. And if you want to know any more about Rotary, please ask any one of us. We'd be happy to help. Okay, thanks to our producers, Michael Shermis and Sally Gaskell, for helping us. Michael left us for a minute earlier today, and I about called off the whole meeting. So thank you so much for all the work you do to keep everything running smoothly. We couldn't do it without you. And our roundabout reporter for one last week this month is Jim Bright. Thank you for putting together our fantastic newsletter that keeps us all informed and ready to serve. Birthdays, we're celebrating Kevin Hopper Newdstrom on August 28th, Winston Schindel August 29th, Mike Hoff August 30th, and Shelley Yoder also on August 30th. Happy birthday. And membership anniversaries, our very own Leslie Green has been a member for 19 years. Congratulations. And Katie Beck has been a member for 2 years. Thank you for being a part of this club. We have a few announcements today. For anyone interested, the Bloomington Hospital Site Redevelopment Project has an online survey. You can hop over to bloomingtonhospitalsite.com to take that. You can take it until September 1st. And thank you to everyone who completed the survey regarding the pledge. There was no clear consensus from the survey. The responses were split between those who would like to continue to recite the pledge and those who want to discontinue. About 20% indicated that they didn't feel strongly either way. So the board, after meeting last Thursday, has concluded that we will continue on with the compromise that we observed today. We'll observe respectful personal reflection at the opening of our meetings, and we will reevaluate this decision when we resume in-person meetings. If you'd like to say the pledge to yourself, that of course is your decision, but we ask that all remain muted during this time to allow for everyone's personal reflection in the way that they want to use that time. Please join us this Thursday for our physically distanced social gathering at Karst Park Shelter number 9 from 5:30 to 7:30. If you purchased a Rotary mask, they'll be there for you to pick up. We have a couple extras that we can sell, and we'll just let Natalie know when you get there. if you aren't able to attend, Natalie will deliver your mask to you. So you get a special surprise. You might want to hold off so you get to see her. And one final announcement, Judy Bush's memorial service will be online this Saturday, August 29th at 11 a.m. on the St. Thomas Lutheran Church YouTube channel. The link will be in the roundabout, and there will be another link on the site for viewing and printing the bulletin for the service. Okay, volunteering service spotlight. Always offering at least one volunteering opportunity for people to take advantage of, but we have 5 right now. Helping Hands is always available. You can visit their site and the phone number. All of this is listed in the roundabout. If you're interested, I encourage you to take them up on their offer for helping people in the community. Community Kitchen, we have one more slot available this Friday. This is our last official shifts we're taking. Please help us fill this last opportunity. I went last Friday. It was so much fun, and they really need the support. So we won't formally take on any more shifts unless there's interest, but we do have one spot available. Friends of Lake Monroe, continue to check their website for opportunities. It will once again be listed in the roundabout. And Wheeler Mission, Josie gave me some great information about what they have available. They're an organizational member with us, so I encourage us to take them up on some opportunities. And Josie linked it in the chat there. Thank you. They serve 3 meals a day, every day, and need volunteer support either through directly serving or providing SAC meals for the shelter. And they have some virtual opportunities. So they need video production, script, and combining footage help. They will gather all the photos and footage, and you could help them combine into a finished product if that's what you do well. They also need some help drafting newsletters, and I'm not going to recommend anyone from our club, but I know we have some real standout newsletter creators. So they're looking to send out e-newsletters bi-monthly, and they need some content creation help and also social media contact. They're looking for a strategic social media plan. And they're hoping to have 2 posts a week, and they need help creating content. So you can check out that link that Josie linked for us and contact her directly if you need more information. And our last opportunity, always ongoing, our very own Teachers Warehouse needs volunteers almost every day, Monday through Friday. Volunteer by emailing volunteers@teacherswarehouse.org. So that was a lot, but now it's time for Happy Dollars. So Michael, can you share the link in the chat to donate? And who's up? Who has something to be happy about? Mike Baker.
I've got one. Well, I figured out what charcuterie meant. So I don't know if you can see this or not, but it's a beautiful, used to call it a cheese and meat tray. And the reason I'm happy is because I'm going to get one of these because I've put in my first donation for the Bloomington Rotary Toast, which, as you know, is for a wonderful cause, Hoosier Hills Food Bank. So to get one of these, all you have to do is go to Bloomington or go to bloomingtontoast.com, and you can sign up and do it easy. I really am happy that some Rotarians in our club and outside of our club have already started to register for the Bob Hamill Toast. So I hope you'll join me and you can learn what a charcuterie is.
Thank you, Mike. But that address is rotarytoast.com.
Right.
rotarytoast.com.
Thank you.
And this is Glenda. I would thank Judy for her reflection and note that there will be a march on Saturday from the Convention Center to the History Center in celebration of Votes for Women. Socially distanced groups will be going down the beeline and headed to the History Center. And so I encourage you, whether you can come or not, to at least pause and reflect momentarily that it's been a long, hard fight for that many women to get the right to vote. And as Judy said, we still have lots of work to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenda. Dave
Hi,
Meyer.
I'm Raj. I pledged $10 in honor of the 100th anniversary for women votes.
Thanks, Raj. Dave.
I'm happy that my youngest grandchild, Fletcher, is now, after 6 months, starting to eat solid food He has already voted. He likes blueberries and sweet potatoes, but green beans, not so much.
Anyone else? I can't see everyone on the screen at the same time, so you'll have to just speak up. Charlotte? You're on mute, Charlotte.
Okay, is that better?
Uh-huh.
I can't let Raj be the only one to be happy about suffrage. So I'll match his $10 for being happy about suffrage for those who have it, and hope and a hopeful happy dollars for those who have yet to gain it fully.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Mm-hmm.
Katie Beck.
Hi, everybody. Sorry I can't join you on video today, but nice to see all of you. I am happy that the Switchyard Park is starting to do outdoor socially distanced concerts. I don't know if anybody was able to see the Bloomington Symphony Orchestra this past weekend, but also happy to tell all of you that my husband David and his band Matik Sando will be playing on that big, beautiful stage on September 4th at 5:30 p.m. So they're doing ticketed, it's free, but ticketed. So go to the Bloomington Parks website to get a ticket, and hope to see you there.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Any, Steve Engel.
Hi. I'm Happy Dollars. Wanted to donate 5 just because I live in a great neighborhood and there are a lot of accomplished musicians in my neighborhood. And we are having a porch music walk-by event Saturday afternoon. And all the people from bagpipes to bass fiddles are going to be playing their instruments. And we're just going to walk around the neighborhood and enjoy the music. They're all really nice, from kids from 12 years old on up to geezers like me. That's all.
What's your neighborhood? What is your neighborhood?
Oh, Devon Longwood neighborhood. It's right next to Elm Heights, but the south of Elm Heights.
Okay.
That's delightful. Thank you for sharing that.
Nice idea.
Anyone else? Speak now or forever hold your happiness. Okay, well, if something pops up, just speak up later. But for now, I will introduce Liz Feidel to introduce our speaker for today.
Well, apparently I didn't know I was going to introduce her. All I knew is that I submitted her application to be on the program committee, so I'm caught a little off guard. What I can tell you is that I heard Janine about, this all came about because I heard Janine do a presentation similar to this about, a month or two ago, and I was at a breakfast meeting, and you know, those breakfast meetings can be a little tricky, but she made the presentation delightful. She had a lot of information about slides on history of women in Indiana who we haven't heard about with regard to women who are involved in getting the vote and that sort of thing. And I just found it all delightful. I do know and remember that she is a faculty member in the Department of History, I believe. I don't remember how long she's been there. Maybe she can help me with the introduction a little bit when she begins, but I would like to have you help me welcome her to the program today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is it's such a pleasure to be here today, especially on of all days. This is a great day. So I'm going to share this presentation and get started. Yes, I've been here at IU this is only my second year, so I'm still getting to know everyone. I wish I could meet you all in person, but this is really as good as it gets other than meeting you in person. So thank you so much. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes about the history of women's suffrage in the state of Indiana, and I'd love to talk afterwards and take any questions. So usually, sorry, from slideshow, I'm still getting used to doing everything on Zoom. So here we go. So usually when we think about the history of women's suffrage, we think about the national organizations people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and their very long story of working for women's suffrage from before the Civil War up until, you know, the 19th Amendment. And in the state of Indiana, we do have people who were working on that very long range plan for women's suffrage. In other words, they were working on women's suffrage way before the passage of the 19th Amendment, way before this was really an amendment. So say for example, in the state of Indiana in 1851, we have the founding of the Indiana Women's Rights Association. And we have, you know, a historical marker even that celebrates this. The Indiana Women's Rights Association was founded in 1851, and I have here listed some of their key goals. They were interested in basically getting women opportunities that men had, professional opportunities, educational opportunities, rights to divorce and rights for women within marriage to have property, to have opportunities to basically have make business decisions, and basically to get women respect in society. And they thought that women's suffrage was part of that. And we can trace the story of women's suffrage in the state of Indiana through the Indiana Women's Rights Association if we want, because they're still basically around when they change, of course, a lot over the next more than 50 years, but they're still around when the 19th Amendment comes up for discussion and ratification. And so we could tell the story of women's rights in Indiana from the perspective of this organization, because they stick around and they have lots of people who are in it for the long haul. However, I think that if we told the story of women's suffrage through the history of this major organization, we miss a lot of the other suffrage work that's going on in the state of Indiana. So this picture that I'm showing you right here is a picture of all of the African-American settlements, or at least all of those that this historian Annalisa Cox found. And this is a picture that comes out of her book called The Bone and Sinew of the Land. All these history of African-American settlements this is a picture of all these African-American settlements that she found from the antebellum period. And if you look here at the state of Indiana, Professor Cox found 92 settlements, separate individual settlements of African-American families who were settled in the state of Indiana as of the mid-19th century, as of this period before the war. If you think of that, and you think that's a really strong statement. It's a really strong, it's a very important conclusion and observation that she found, especially as we think about the 1851 Constitution and what it was and its relationship with the founding of this Indiana Women's Suffrage Association. In 1851, the Indiana Constitution, as it was revised very intentionally to limit African-American land ownership and to very severely limit African-American rights of voting rights in the state. And this was a very intentional change in the revision of this Constitution. It wasn't subtle, it was very non-subtle, it was very, very bold. In this revision of the Constitution, 1851, not only was the language of maleness, in other words, the idea that only male citizens could vote, inserted into the Constitution, but also this language of whiteness. Previously, African Americans owned land all over the state, as we saw, but as of this 1851 Constitution, language was inserted to say that every white male citizen of the United States who's residing in Indiana could vote. And not only that, but no African Americans, no people of color, and I have here the particular language that is in that Constitution, had the right of suffrage. And not only that, not only were people of color prohibited from voting as of this 1851 Constitution, but also there was prohibitions in the Constitution for African Americans to own property. And the way it's put here is that the Constitution held you're not allowed to sell property to people of color, to African Americans. No, as it's quoted in the Constitution of 1851, no Negro or mulatto shall come into or settle in the state after the adoption of this Constitution. So if we think of that, if we remember that in 1851, the Constitution was changed to prohibit African-American settlement in the state and prohibit continued African-American settlement. So those families that were already in the state were not allowed to basically sell their property to anyone. And this is coming alongside lots of extralegal violence against African-American families that Professor Cox talks about in her book. And we recognize that we have to now rethink how we're going to tell the story of women's suffrage in the state. We have to rethink, why is the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association not doing more to talk about race, to talk about universal suffrage for the sake of African Americans? If, as of 1851, it's not just women who are prohibited from voting and from owning property, but it's also all these people of color, all of these many, many families. Sorry. So I want to think about women's suffrage from that perspective, that women in 1851 are severely limited in their political rights. And this is a really backtracking, because women had more rights in these early years of settlement than they did as of this constitutional change. But also African Americans are so severely limited. So why is it that this Women's Suffrage Association, 1851, is really emphasizing women over people of color? I would have argued a few months ago that they were really only prioritizing women's rights. I've learned since that there are some people in that Women's Suffrage Association from 1851 who were interested in discussing these rights and who saw these two things as co-joined, like many other suffragettes around the country. But that was not their priority. The priority was women's rights first. And in that case, I think we need to tell the story of women's suffrage, or of suffrage in the state of Indiana, differently. And that is, I think we need to think about all of these other organizations that are developing in the state of Indiana from 1851 forward, that are committed to women's rights, that are committed to universal suffrage. And they're not only committed to white women's suffrage, but are also committed to the concept of universal suffrage that goes beyond just white women. One particularly large and vibrant organization in the state of Indiana in the late 19th century is actually the Social Democratic Party, which becomes the Socialist Party. Many people say this is because of Eugene Debs. Other people would say Eugene Debs is big because there's so many socialists in the state of Indiana that he has this platform that is sort of ready-made, and he becomes popular because of that. But in the state of Indiana, as one person described it, Indiana, or especially Terre Haute, is sort of Grand Central for socialism in the United States, which is almost hard to believe sometimes, but it really was. Indiana feeds the Social Democratic Party a lot. And a lot of the major meetings for the Socialist Party in the late 19th and early 20th century are actually taking place in Indianapolis. When the Social Democratic Party is founded in 1898, in their platform principles, they dedicate themselves to universal suffrage, or as they put it, revision of our antiquated federal constitution in order to remove obstacles to full and complete control of the government by all people, irrespective of sex. And one thing that's really interesting to me about the Socialist Party from the beginning is that they see themselves as committed to universal suffrage of all people, not just for women's suffrage. They are in favor of women's suffrage. They're also actually really in favor of African-American suffrage, even in the state of Indiana, even in a moment in Indiana when in the 1890s, we have multiple lynchings, we have a very active Ku Klux Klan, and we have a state legislature that has a lot of people who are actually committed publicly to repealing Black suffrage. There was, in the Constitution, Black people don't have the right to vote in Indiana in the 1890s. But generally in the North, African Americans in many other places do have the right to vote. And there are people who are in elected leadership in the state of Indiana in the 1890s, early 1900s, who are against Black people voting nationally, who stand for a lot of the same principles as the Democratic Party in the South, which is to limit all African American participation. The Socialist Party is really against that, and they see themselves as the only party in 1901 that is really committed to universal suffrage. In their 1901 meeting, which is their national convention, which takes place in Indianapolis, they have multiple African American participants, and I only found 3 in attendance. I bet there's more if I kept looking through. And 2 of these people are from Indiana, and I looked up their stories and census records, and these are workers. One of these men owned a barbershop. One of these men is a miner, and they participate in the Socialist Party, and they talk about the importance of universal suffrage from the platform. The Socialist Party again commits themselves in 1901 to using the ballot in defense of their own interests, meaning they really believe that if more people could vote, if workers could vote of all types, they would be able to change the political system in the state of Indiana. And I'm going to go through this quickly, but I can't not mention that, again, in the early 1900s, in the state of Indiana, there's a lot of discussion about how, as they would put it, Negro suffrage failed. In other words, African Americans really should no longer have any political rights, because they're basically continuing the mythology, the arguments that have been made in the South about how African Americans basically corrupted political leadership when they were in their brief moment after Reconstruction, and therefore they should not have not participate politically in the country because they are unable to do so. They are not fit to be citizens, as the language said. And I hate to even repeat a lot of that language, but that is really publicly visible language. That's what people who are talking about who are publicly elected in our state in the early 1900s. I found evidence of this, say, in reading the African-American newspapers. African-American newspapers often talk about how, as they put it in 1904, we believe that a large majority of the voters of the North as well as the South are weary of Negro suffrage. In the State Assembly in 1905, they say, foremost among all of these problems that they mention, I place the preservation of the franchise from pollution. And pollution is any expansion of the franchise. So in 1905, we have many organizations that are working for social betterment. We have the Socialist Party, which is doing their own thing and basically trying to get people registered to vote and get people to participate in unions, but also in a new way of thinking about politics. We also have a growing network of colored women's clubs, or African-American women's clubs, that are dedicated to mutual aid and to social support and to advocacy of various things, including anti-lynching amendments or anti-lynching provisions in the state, which basically, in the state of Indiana, a lot of anti-lynching activism in 1905 was basically about making sure those sheriffs in any counties wherein lynching took place would be prosecuted as criminals. And so working on a small scale to make changes that could be made. And in 1905, this Indiana State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs is dedicated to women's suffrage. That is definitely on their platform.
Ashley.
And always mentioned, but
Ashley.
Oh, sorry. But that's not the only thing they're dedicated to. This is part of their larger work. And so what I think it's important to note is that in the early 20th century, there are actually lots of people who are committed to universal suffrage and lots of people who are dedicated to women's suffrage in particular. The Indiana Women's Suffrage Association, however, is not really dedicated to a lot of these broader issues that are going beyond just women's suffrage. And I think they would say, well, we're a single issue platform. This is how we're going to get change if we just, don't argue about other things. But honestly, that didn't work out for them. As of 1917, in the state of Indiana, they were really pushing to just get this single issue passed. And the Madison-McKinley Act, I almost don't want to get into all of these other things, but the Madison-McKinley Act, which passes in 1917, is really only enforced for a very short period of time. It gets challenged in the state as a state constitutional matter, and the judges in the state determined that it is unconstitutional to allow women the right to vote in the state, and so that all becomes null. If it's unconstitutional to allow women the right to vote in the state, then they needed to have a new constitutional convention, and therefore it went nowhere. Basically, in the state of Indiana, the only way that women got the right to vote was through the ratification of the national amendment, of the federal amendment to the federal constitution. The Indiana Women's Suffrage Association was actually unsuccessful in getting women the right to vote in our state in particular. So if we think about this, I think it's interesting to think, who was it that was pushing Indiana to ratify this amendment? In the state of Indiana, we have lots of people spread out all over, and as I said, most of the people who are in the state legislature are really conservatives. They're Democrats and Republicans, but most of these people are actually not really in favor of women's suffrage. they're really against the union movement, the labor movement. And they have kept out the Socialist Party, despite the fact that the Socialist Party is sort of located in the state of Indiana. So how is it that Indiana came to endorse this federal amendment? Well, what I found, and I would really argue, although I'm still honestly working through this, but I'm convinced as of now that the Socialist Party, in particular their Women's National Committee, is really influential in doing the ground organizing, the grassroots organizing, to get various players throughout the state to put pressure on their elected leaders to ratify the 19th Amendment. So I'm going to tell you a little bit in my remaining time about some of these people, some of these women who are doing this grassroots organizing really in that last few years between 1912 and 1919 to get people to put pressure on Americans overall to change the culture in Indiana to support women's suffrage. So the Women's National Committee is this national committee of the Socialist Party. And they also have, within this national committee, they have what they call the Women's Bureau. The Women's Bureau is dedicated to women's issues, women's socialist issues, as they would put it in 1912, starting in 1912. In the state of Indiana, Lilith Martin, born in Dublin, Indiana, married in Anderson, Indiana. I've been able to find a little bit of her life. Is the head basically of the Women's Bureau. She's in her 20s at this time, and she's actually going to go on later in her life to become an elected official in Pennsylvania as a socialist. So she's young, and it seems like she really is very ambitious. Under her leadership in 1918-1919, she collects 5,000 signatures from the state of Indiana to bring to legislators in the state of Indiana, saying that these are all these people. She collects through her leadership. She has lots of people working for her. All of these signatures that she brings up to the state, basically saying we have lots of people around our state who really do support women's suffrage. She eventually brings those signatures also to the socialist congressman from Wisconsin at the time, whose name is Victor Berger, and invites him to present these as representatives of the Socialist Party. So because there's basically no elected officials in the state of Indiana, she goes to Wisconsin and says, look at all these socialist people who are in favor of women's suffrage. And that makes news, and it makes her feel like she's really a leader, even though she's really young at the time. Her father was actually in politics, but her father then died, and she basically becomes very well respected around the state. One of the people that works with her is Rosa Lenhart. Rosa Lenhart, her orbit was in Indianapolis. In 1912, she's 35 years old. She has 2 kids. Their ages 4 and 6. I found this in census records. She goes to the state convention, and she's talking about wage slavery. She's very active in organizing women throughout the state, especially working women. And she works, as far as I can tell, she goes out and she goes to places where there are working women, and she tries to talk with them about getting further training, about the importance of getting equal pay for equal work. And she's very interested in this idea of equal companionship within marriage. And she sees herself as an advocate for the idea of social equality. She's one of these people who leads meetings where they're dedicated to women's issues, but men are invited, and men are invited for the sake of learning from women, because this is part of the Women's Bureau overall under Lilith Martin's leadership, that Lilith wants to get men comfortable listening to women and learning from women. The women's priorities as of 1912, like I just said, they include education for women, especially women in the trades, women to basically move up in the trades and become more and more skilled. Mothers' pensions, which is basically an early form of Social Security, the idea that women should have some sort of remuneration from the state if their husbands die, because they need to be able to take care of their children without going to work or putting their kids in different types of well, at the time they would call them sort of early foster care or various kinds of homes for children. And they really believe that women should have the right to not have to do that if they didn't want to. And finally, I'm going to talk about Florence Waddles, who I've discovered the most about, and I find really, really interesting. And I was so excited when I actually found her picture. So Florence Waddles is a woman who is working for the Women's Bureau. She's working for Lilith Martin and this other team of basically young women who are really dedicated to women's suffrage. And she organizes male workers, mimers throughout the state of Indiana. As well as far as I can tell, women in the textile trades. And she organizes them in favor of women's suffrage. I'm sorry, I'll go back. In the year, she eventually gets nominated, but she loses in her public election. She runs for public office throughout the 19-teens, or 1912 and then onward. She has speaking engagements in 1913 in Angola, Elkhart, Mishawaka, South Bend, Michigan City, LaPorte, East Chicago, Indiana Harbor, and Attica. She goes and reports to the Socialist Party National Committee, which means she goes to the national convention for the Socialist Party, and she eventually runs for public office multiple times. But she's organizing among both male and female workers, and she gets a line. She gets called out in the History of Women's Suffrage, the authoritative History of Women's Suffrage, written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and edited on, this very large volume of "This is how women got the right to vote." She gets a line in there for her ability to work with suffrage, with other types of suffrage organizations throughout the state, and eventually get the United Mine Workers in the state of Indiana to, as a whole, endorse women's suffrage. And she gets credit, now I'm just trying to find the exact quote, but she gets credit according to this national narrative of women's suffrage as a woman who was able to basically get lots of union workers who usually don't see women's suffrage as a highest priority in the organizing to sign on the dotted line and say they support it as an organization. And she brings that back to the state and says, look, all of these Americans are in favor of women's suffrage. You have to ratify the amendment, even though your state won't grant that within the state. So overall, I find this a really interesting story. And one of the most interesting things about this is, to me, is that conventional politics in their own, in the way that states are supposed to work, where, you do something at the local level and then you advance it beyond that, just didn't work in the state of Indiana. The people who are elected to government in the state, both the governor and the legislature and the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, did everything they could to stop women's suffrage. But this grassroots organizing actually worked a lot more. And these were really young socialist women who made it happen. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Janine. Fascinating. I'm sure we could have many presentations covering your work here, and we'd love to have you back sometime. But I would like to open it up for questions now. If anyone has questions, I know that you will. So, Owen Johnson.
We tend to think about women's suffrage as something that was achieved, and then sort of it disappears as an issue. What happened to some of these women that you were talking about? Did they give up politics? Were they satisfied? What do you know about them?
That is such a good question. So again, Florence Waddles and Lilith Martin both stay in politics. And in their case, they stay in socialist politics. They run for political office throughout the rest of their life. And I think that's really interesting. And of course, they're not getting elected in the state of Indiana, but they are in other places. Some of them, or at least one of them, are actually getting into school board politics. They're interested in education, because those are places, I would imagine, where they're trying to promote girls' opportunities and women's opportunities. And in the late 19th century, really women didn't have a lot of opportunities even in public schools. And that was really rapidly changing by the early 20th century. And a lot of the women who want to shepherd in a generation of women who were well educated in public schools are a lot of these women who had previously worked on both suffragist and socialist work.
I have a question. John L. Lewis founded the United Mine Workers in Indiana, and that was, you know, over in the Terre Haute area. Were the United Mine Workers at all interested or aligned with the socialists?
Yes, there were at multiple times in their history. Yes, there were. I mean, it's interesting how in labor history it's so hard to describe an organization, because even say the American Federation of Labor has tons of socialists, but officially the party is not, you know, the union is not in favor of socialism, but lots and lots of its members are. And that's, you would say the same, I would say the same thing about lots and lots of mine workers.
Yeah.
That even if it's not in the party platform, if that's what comprises the membership, you could make the argument that it is a organization that leads in that direction.
Yeah, and Debs was out of Terre Haute.
Yes.
And Debs has relationships with many of these prominent suffragettes too. You know, he has a famous interaction with Susan B. Anthony and with several other suffragettes. And it's part of the platform. I mean, I think the Socialist Party really should be recognized as part of the history of women's suffrage. But it's interesting that we don't usually talk that way.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
So,
Janine, as you have worked on this, have you found any information about women in Bloomington being involved?
I have looked, and it certainly might be there, but I haven't found it myself yet. And I find that interesting. I think a lot of these, yeah, I think a lot of these socialists are really looking for really, really poor people. They're expecting, and whether or not that's true or not, they're expecting that they're going to find that what they want to organize are the people who don't feel like they have any other power. And as far as I know, in Bloomington in the late 19th or 20th century, there are fewer of those types of people. But I'm still working on that.
Thanks.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm unclear. You started out talking about the African Americans in Indiana and the groups that work with them. And as I remember, the suffragettes eventually split from trying to get the vote for any African Americans because they thought they were more likely to be able to get the vote for women without bringing in an additional issue. So do you want to talk, or can you talk a little bit, or have I just missed it? That kind of, we started out talking about I don't remember the exact name, but the African American Women's Association. And then where did that stop being a discussion?
That's such a good question. And so the question of when did it stop being important to them? I think that's an important question. I don't know the answer yet. I know Anita Morgan, who has a new book called We Must Be Fearless, the history of suffrage in the state of Indiana. I think she begins to address that question too. So I'm still working on the question about when did this Indiana Women's Suffrage Association just sort of drop it entirely? All I know, what I can say for now is that it's not a priority for the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association until around 1918, 1919, until they realize that there's this possibility of getting this federal amendment ratified, until basically the whole women's suffrage movement in the United States transitions to doing this thing where we have the states ratify the amendment as opposed to just pursuing suffrage state by state in different ways. Once that happens, once the program, the national program or the national strategy for women's suffrage changes, then this Indiana Women's Suffrage Association starts building coalition. They start actually trying to reach out to all sorts of ethnic societies and mutual aid societies and all sorts of people, because they realize that they need to build coalition more broadly. And then suddenly they start building relationships with national colored women's clubs and other African and Black churches and Black leaders, because they realize that they matter. But they don't do that until they have this transition in strategy.
Okay, another question, if I may. When did the colored people begin to have the ability to stay in Indiana, to sell their land? I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
there has been a transition to that. When did that occur?
That is such a good question. And that, unfortunately, I can't speak with authority on answering that question. I know that we have at least one PhD student in our history department right now who's working on things related to that question. And Annalisa Cox's book came out just a couple of years ago, maybe 2 years ago. And so I honestly don't know what the very newest research is on this, but I would say that this is a story that we're still doing research to understand. And of course, it's not complete. It's not that suddenly in 1851 every Black family gets wiped out. It's not complete. So I don't know exactly how that proceeds. What we do know is that voting power dramatically decreases, and new property sales to African American families decrease. But I don't know all of the particulars. I think we do need to do more county level research, which is what a lot of people are doing right now, to really see the story on the granular level and then extrapolate more broadly.
Thank you.
But thank you so much. That's a really good question, and I wish I had a good answer for it. Yes, Glenda is showing us a picture of Anita Morgan's book.
Oh, what's the name of it?
We Must Be Fearless.
We Must
It's
Be Fearless.
called We Must Be Fearless.
Okay, got that.
And it just came out this year.
Yeah, I have one too.
Thank you.
I have a question about the current issue that's resurfaced in the debate between women's rights and African American rights is eugenics. And apparently there was a huge flashpoint that shifted a lot of focus away from universal suffrage to exclusively women's suffrage. Could you comment on the historical context of that?
That's a really good point. So eugenics is, as you know, this scientific racism, this belief among lots of university educated people that there are there genetic and sort of scientific reasons why white people are smarter and more civilized, etc. And I think it's a really good point that you're raising, that as of the early 1900s, this idea that Negro suffrage fails, this is entirely in quotes, this idea is not just, according to the people who are saying that, a matter of social policies, it's a matter of science, that there are a lot of people who are believing, well, Black people are not capable of this type of citizenship because they're on this spectrum of civilized people and they're not really capable of self-government. So I think that's a very good point, that eugenics is part of this early 20th century movement where people are telling themselves, people are rationalizing these arguments about why white people should run society and Black people should not be participants on an equal level. That's a fair point about where a lot of these ideas about white supremacy in the early 20th century are coming from. However, I don't know, I think historians are still debating to what extent does eugenics actually help us understand, say, all of these efforts to suppress and oppress African Americans. I don't know. That you're right. That's coming alongside a lot of these other forms of violence, and it's rationalizing a lot of decisions that people are making. But how deeply is that believed? I don't know. I know one of my expertise is honestly socialism and American religion, and among historians of American religion, we still don't know to what extent is eugenics really forming Protestant and Catholics' understandings of themselves. Like, we don't actually know how deeply eugenics is informing people's self-perceptions and how much eugenics is sort of a rhetoric people are using to rationalize other decisions. So I would say I honestly don't know the answer to the question of how much is eugenics forming all this, because even in religion, when you get into people's interior lives, people are very rarely talking about eugenics. So we honestly don't know how much people really believed in that type of rhetoric that they talked about.
It does seem to be a flashpoint currently within the women's movement in reading and talking about Black Lives Matter positions. There's a lot of sensitivity about that and a lot of a sense that, that Black people were abandoned by the women's movement. Black women were abandoned. And so part of the healing process right now, I think, is to dig into all of that history and talk about it, because eugenics was a dirty secret, that needs to be dealt with and talked about. And it is starting to be talked about now within the national women's movement.
Oh, so you're talking, I see what you're saying, that this was the idea of literally sterilizing women of color, which is definitely a conversation people are having, and maybe would argue that this is part of the birth control movement. So I see what you're saying, that this very effort to actually keep African Americans from reproducing is a big part of the early 20th century. I know Ruth Engs, our emeritus historian here at IU, or public historian, has written about this, about the racial elements of public health in the early 20th century.
Thank you so much. We need to close briefly, but Janine, do you have a few moments to stay if there are any additional questions?
Sure.
Okay, great. In honor of your presentation today, we'll be giving a donation to Teachers Warehouse. So thank you so much for being here and giving us more insight into something maybe we didn't know all the background for. Sally Gaskell will now introduce our next week's presentation.
Next week, which is September the 1st, we'll be hearing from our own Sandy Keller, who's going to be talking about My Sister's Closet, a community partnership since 1998.
And if you didn't see it in his bi-weekly column in the HT, Tim Jessen wrote about Wheeler Mission and Sandy Keller and My Sister's Closet, making a difference in the life of a young mother. Please check that out. It'll be linked in the roundabout for you to read. And Michael, please share the four-way test graphic as we close. We'll recite this together. Of the things we think, say, and do, first, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill, better friendships? Fourth,
will be beneficial to all concerned.
And fifth, is it fun? Thank you so much again for being here today. And if anyone has any additional questions for Janine, please let us know now.
I'll ask something. This is Liz. I wondered even in the beginning when I saw this presentation,